Hello and welcome to section 8.1, the weapons of quadratic solving. Oh yeah, we're talking about weapons today. Some people say that what I'll be teaching you are the weapons of math destruction. Kaboom! Okay, before I teach you about the math weapons here, I do want to take a moment and talk about Alma chapter 24, because there is a group of people in this chapter, the anti-Nephi Lehis, who are an amazing example unto me and unto all of us, because they teach us about the importance of keeping covenants. Let's read in verse 17. It says, "And now it came to pass that when the king had made an end of these sayings, all of the people were assembled together, and they took their swords, and they took all their weapons, all of them, which were used for the shedding of man's blood, and they did bury them deep, deep into the earth. And this they did, it being in their view a testimony to God and also to men, that they never would use weapons again for the shedding of man's blood. And this they did, vouching and covenanting with God, that rather than shed the blood of their brethren, they would give up their own lives. And rather than take away from a brother, they would give unto him. And rather than spend their days in idleness, they would labor abundantly with their hands." Oh, I love this scripture, because we need to understand how important it is that we keep our covenants. They didn't want to have any temptations in front of them, so they took all their weapons and they buried them. How did they bury them? Deep, deep into the ground, so it wouldn't be a temptation. There would be no temptation to break a covenant. Oh, I encourage you and myself, challenge you and myself, that we can keep our covenants. If there's anything that might make us not be able to keep our covenant, I challenge you to bury it deep in the ground so that we can keep those and that the Lord can bless us. Okay, now let's get on to the weapons of math destruction. Math weapons. Oh yeah, today we're talking about math weapons and how to kill quadratics. Our goal is to kill quadratics today, and there's a variety of math weapons that we can use. In fact, we already learned one of the weapons. Back in chapter 5, we learned about weapon number 1. Weapon number 1, and that weapon was factoring. Oh yeah, factoring. Factoring was the first weapon. Now, we didn't call it a weapon because I didn't want you to know at that time, but you had actually learned about the first weapon of math destruction, which is factoring. Now, if we were looking at a scale of deadliness, like this is deadly, deadly, and this is like weak, factoring would be right about here. Oh man, I'll tell you. In fact, it's as low as can be. In fact, I'm going to put the arrow right over here. Factoring is weak. It's a weak way to kill a polynomial. It doesn't work very often. Factoring. And that's why in chapter 5, we spend a lot of time factoring, but I didn't want you to know that it's a weak weapon, because some people will say, oh, well, I don't have to learn it. But factoring is a key concept that we do in our algebra. And so, but you should be aware it's weak. Let me show you why. Okay, let's do a factoring question really quick and remind you of what it was like in chapter 5. Here was one. Let's go with x squared minus 4 equals 0. Okay, we said, remember, the rules of factoring were to step number 1, get it equal to 0, get equal to 0, and that's what we have here. Step 2, factor it, factor. So if I was going to do that, I would factor this. This is a perfect square. And so we square root the x squared to get x and x, and we square root the 4 to get 2 and 2. And our signs are 1 plus, 1 minus. Step number 3 is to set each factor equal to 0. So I say x plus 2 equals 0, and x minus 2 equals 0. And here I get x equals negative 2, and x equals positive 2. And there are our answers. And we're like, oh, okay, that's not that bad. So, and then we solve. And so you might say, well, why is that so weak, brother? Oh, it worked very well. In fact, even when we learned the first fundamental theorem of polynomial algebra, we were supposed to find two answers, and look, we got two answers. The problem with factoring is that lots of our polynomials, like 95% of our polynomials, can't actually be factored. If I took this 4 out and put a 5 and said solve this, you'd say, oh, I can't solve that, brother. I don't know what the square root of 5 is. Or if I took it out and put 8, you'd be like, I don't know the square root of that. Or square root of 13, don't know that. Or 14, don't know that. There's tons of these. Or what if I change this to a plus? Plus 9. We can't factor that. We only know how to factor perfect squares when there's subtraction. Or what if I put 11 here? All of a sudden you see that lots of polynomials don't actually factor and that they're actually prime. Now in chapter 5, we gave you a lot of problems that did factor, and that's great. But now we're to the point where we're like, whoa, we need more tools. Factoring does not work for this type of problem. So today I wanted to introduce to you two new tools for solving quadratics. The new tool we're learning today, the new weapon of maths destruction. Weapon number 2 is called root solve. Oh yeah, root solve. And it's pretty strong. It's stronger than factoring. I would put it probably right about here. It's not super killer, but it does kill a little more than factoring. Root solve. Let me show you an example of how to root solve. Here's a problem right here. X squared minus 20 equals 0. So this can't be factored because I don't know the square root of 20. So that's not going to work. So let's come up for some steps for root solving. Step number 1 is going to be get the x squared by itself. Get x squared alone. Now that's different than factoring. When we factored, we actually got it equal to 0. Here, I actually want to get the x squared by itself. So we're going to plus 20 to both sides, and I get x squared equals 20. In step number 2, I'm now going to get rid of the square. I can undo a square by using what's the opposite of a power? Oh, it's a root. We're going to root both sides. Root both sides. Yeah, we root both sides here. Cha-ching, cha-ching. And that gets me x equals the square root of 20. Now, you should be aware that in step number 3, you're going to have to add a plus or minus to your answer. Add plus or minus. I'm actually going to write a plus or minus here. And you say, wow, why is that? Well, remember, when we root solve, we've got to find two answers. So whenever you square root both sides of an equation, you've got to put a plus or minus. Okay, and then in step 4, it's to solve, or in this case, we got to simplify. Solve / simplify. Square root of 20, there's a wedding here. I break up the 4, I get 2 and 2. So we've got a wedding in 2's. And so my final answer is x equals plus or minus. These guys move out of the house, become 1, and left inside is 5. So the final answer here is x equals plus or minus 2 root 5. There's two answers there. 2 root 5 and negative 2 root 5. And that's how we root solve.
To the boards!
Okay, it's time for you to go to the boards. Give these two problems a try, question number 1 and number 2. Work on them in your notebook. Pause the video now and unpause it when you're ready to check your answer. Welcome back. Let's do it. We're using the weapon root solve to kill polynomials today. Let's do it. Step number 1, you got to get the x squared alone. So I'm getting this alone by itself. I'm going to go ahead and minus 9 to both sides, minus 9. I get x squared equals negative 9. I square root both sides. That's my next step, root both sides. When I do that, I get x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 9. Don't forget to write your plus or minus there. The square root of 9 is 3, but because it was negative, don't forget chapter 7, yeah, you got to put an I in there. And so there's my answers. My answer is x equals 3i and negative 3i, or plus or minus 3i. We can just leave it like that. Cool, so we can get i's in our answers. That's okay. Let's try number 2. Number 2, we got to get the x squared alone. So we're going to get this parenthesis alone. I'm going to minus 1 to both sides. That gets me x plus 3 squared equals 13. Okay, now I want to undo, I'm going to root both sides to get rid of this square. So I square root and square root. That gets me x plus 3 equals plus or minus root 13. Don't forget to add your plus or minus. On the step that you square root, you need to write a plus or minus. Now I'm going to finish solving. I just got to undo this plus 3. So we'll minus 3 to both sides. And I get x equals negative 3 plus or minus root 13. Usually we put the number first in front of the root. So I wrote negative 3 and then put a plus or minus root 13. You could have written it backwards, plus or minus root 13 minus 3, but looks a little weird. Usually we're going to put the plus or minus in the middle. Let's do 2 more just to make sure you got this root solve idea down. Here's question number 3 and number 4. Go ahead and pause the video and use the weapon of root solving to kill this quadratic. Good luck. Okay, let's see how you did. Step number 1 is get the x squared alone. So I've got this plus 8 here. I'm going to minus it over. Minus 8, minus 8. That gets me x squared equals 25. Okay, now that the x squared is by itself, we root both sides, square root, and I get x equals, don't forget your plus or minus here, square root of 25 is just 5. So that's it. Our answer is 5 and negative 5, or you'll just see it as plus or minus 5. But don't forget that this is 2 answers, okay? And we were told we had to find 2 answers. Ooh, let's go to question number 4. Here we go. Step 1, get the x squared alone. It's already by itself. The squared is by itself. So let's go ahead and undo the square by doing a square root. I'm left with 2x plus 8 equals, I got to put plus or minus because I just square rooted. Square root of 16 is 4, but there is a negative, which means it's actually 4i. Okay, now we got to finish solving by getting the x by itself. So let's minus 8 to both sides. That gets me 2x equals negative 8 plus or minus 4i. And then we'll have to divide by 2 here in the last step. But notice that the 8 and the 4 both can be divided by 2. So we should simplify that. And we should take the 8 divided by 2, that's negative 4, plus or minus the 4 divided by 2 is 2. And so there we go. There's our answer right there. X equals negative 4 plus 2, plus or minus 2i. Okay, well, that's great. Root solving, that's kind of fun. Yeah, killing polynomials with a weapon number 2, root solving. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you weapon number 3 now. In fact, if you want to take a break, right now is a good time to take a break. You could like pause it because weapon number 3 is a little more complicated. But because it's a little more complicated, it's much higher on the kill level. It's about right here. Yeah, its deadliness level is very high. It works almost all the time. This weapon is called completing the square. Complete the square. And yeah, it kind of kills. Complete square. I didn't have enough room there. There we go. Completing the square. So completing the square is basically a combination of these other methods, and I'll show you how it kind of works. Let's say that we had something like x squared plus 6x equals 5. Now, the first step whenever you're completing the square is going to be to get x's all on one side, get x's on the same side. This problem's already set up very nicely to complete the square because my x squared and my x's are on the left side. The 5, we would want to get that over on the other side like we do here. Step 2 is going to be to find the magic number. In fact, I like to call it the poison since we're talking about weapons. You've got to calculate the poison. You'll have to use the formula for that. The formula for the poison is b over 2 all squared. Ooh, that's the poison. And you're going to have to find it. Find the poison. So what we'll do is we'll take this middle term. So this is the A term, this is the B term, this is the C term. And I need to figure out what B over 2 squared is. We take that middle term, we need to divide it by 2 and square it. So let's do it. Let's take 6. I'll just do it over here. 6 divided by 2 and squared. That's the poison. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So the poison for this problem is 9, or the number that completes the square. Okay. Step 3 is add the poison to both sides. Oh yeah. Okay, so we're going to add 9 to both sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 5 plus 9. Notice I get 9 on both sides. Okay. Step 4 will be to factor. Factor. What happens is, so basically, again, I told you completing the square is a combination of root solving and factoring. So what we'll do now is factor this left side. What are the factors of 9 that get me 6? Well, it'd be 3 and 3. That's cool. So notice what happened is because we use the number 9, so that's what the poison does. Because we found the poison, this is always going to factor into a perfect square and allow us to write it as x plus 3 squared. And that equals 5 plus 9, which is 14. So we factored it into a perfect square, and it'll be a parenthesis squared. And why did we want to do that? Well, now it's because we can root solve. So now I'll go ahead and I'll root both sides. I get x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 14. And then we'll just finish solving by minusing the 3 over. So my final answer is negative 3 plus or minus root 14. So the last step there is to root solve. That's a little tricky. Let's do one more like that. Okay, here's one more example. Let's say we had x squared minus 8x plus 20 equals 0. Okay, so let's work on solving this problem using our 5 steps over here. Step number 1 is get x's to the same side. So we just want the x's on the left. So that's going to require me to move the negative 20 over. So I'm minusing 20, minusing 20. So I get negative 20 on the right side. Step 2 is to find the poison. Okay, to calculate the poison, we've got to take this term here, the 8. We're going to take 8, divide it by 2, and square it. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So I'm going to add 16. That's the poison. I'm adding 16 to both sides. Plus 16, plus 16. Okay. Now, the purpose of me doing that is that it's going to allow me to factor this. What are the factors of 16 that get me negative 8? Ooh, it's got to be 4 and 4. Minus 4, minus 4. So it's going to be x minus 4 equals negative 20 plus 16 is negative 4. So that is x minus 4 squared equals negative 4. That's great. Now that we have it factored, we're going to go ahead and root solve. I'm going to square root both sides. That's going to kill the 2. I get x minus 4 equals plus or minus. Don't forget, when you do a root solve, you got to put the plus or minus. Everybody forgets plus or minus. Plus or minus the square root of 4, which is 2, but it was negative, so that's 2i. Now I just need to get the x by itself. So I'm going to plus 4 to both sides, plus 4 to both sides. And so my final answer is 4 plus or minus 2i. There it is. That's how we complete the square. It's a combination of factoring and root solving that makes it very lethal. You can do almost every problem, well, every quadratic that is, anything to the second power using completing the square. Let's have you try a couple. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and try number 5 and number 6 using completing the square. If you need to, I had to delete the steps. If you need to rewind the video to get those steps, go ahead and do it. I just needed the room there. So good luck, pause the video, and we'll see how you did. Welcome back. Let's do it, completing the square. Step number 1, you gotta get the x's alone by themselves. So I'm gonna go ahead and minus 1 to both sides. That gets me -1. So x squared plus 4x equals -1. Step 2 is to find the poison. To find the poison, we take the 4, the middle term, divide it by 2 and square it. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So it's going to be 4 that we add to both sides. Again, the poison was 4, and we add that to both sides. That's going to allow us to factor this. This is going to factor. Factors of 4 that get me 4. Oh, that's 2 and 2. Okay, so that's a perfect square. I can write it like that. And -1 plus 4 is 3. Okay, we're ready to root solve. We got to get rid of this squared by simply square rooting both sides. That gets me x plus 2 equals plus or minus root 3. And in my last step, I'm going to minus 2 to both sides to get the answer of, let's put it over here, x equals -2 plus or minus root 3. Okay, not bad. Question number 6. Ooh. Step number 1, we got to get the x squareds by themselves. Let's use a different color here. Let's use, purple's fun. Okay. X squared plus 6x equals 40. I'm adding the 40 to both sides because I just want the x squareds and the x's on the left-hand side. I got to figure out what the poison is. I take the middle term, 6, divide it by 2. That's 3, and when I square that, it's 9. I add 9 to both sides. Okay, so this is a perfect square. Factors of 9 that get me 6 is 3 and 3. So it's just x plus 3, which is x plus 3 squared, equals 49. Now I can root both sides. I get x plus 3 equals, square root of 49 is just 7. Now don't forget your plus or minus. Oh, I know somebody forgot plus or minus. Don't forget that. When you root solve, you've got to put a plus or minus. Now I minus the 3 over. So I get x equals -3 plus or minus 7. Now, because all we have here is numbers, notice here we had a square root, so we couldn't add those numbers together. But in this one, we can add them together. I can do -3 plus 7, so that's 4. And here I can do -3 minus 7, which is -10. And so those are our two answers. If you can simplify, if it's just numbers here at the end, make sure to calculate what the numbers are, -3 plus 7 and -3 minus 7, so that you get the two answers, which are 4 and -10. Now it is possible, and the last thing we've got to talk about, it is possible that you'll have a number for your A value. All the ones we've done so far have not had a number here. And one of the rules for completing the square, we probably should add it onto your notes as step 0, is that A needs to equal 1. So if you're ever doing a problem like this and you're like, oh, I'm going to complete the square, you got to divide everything by whatever this number is so that you can complete the square. So I would actually divide everything in this problem by 2 before I started. That would get me x squared plus 5x minus 8 equals 0. You gotta have a 1 here, okay? You're gonna wanna add that in as step 0. If you're completing the square, this front number has to be a 1. Then you can go ahead and continue. We would get all the x's to the same side, so I'd add 8 to both sides. I would then have to find the poison. The poison is found by taking b, dividing it by 2, and squaring it. So that's 5. Dividing by 2 and squaring. Ooh, I hate when there's odd numbers here. Be aware, when you have an odd number, you're going to end up getting fractions. 5 squared is 25, and 2 squared is 4. So the number that I'm adding to both sides is 25 fourths, plus 25 fourths, plus 25 fourths. Ooh, fractions. But that's all right, because we will be able to continue this problem because we know that it factors, okay? We made it so that it factors. And it'll always be just whatever half of this number is. Remember when we did the x squared plus 6x plus 9? That one just came out to be x plus 3, right? And when it was x squared plus 4x plus 4, that one just came out to be x plus 2. So when you're doing completing the square, it's just that number there is always just going to be half of the middle term. So this is going to be x plus 5 halves. What are the factors of 25 fourths that gets you 5? Well, it's 5 halves, 5 halves. Okay, equals, oh man, I'm going to need a calculator. What is 8 plus 25 fourths? If you're going to do that by hand, you got to get a common denominator, right? I'm just going to use my calculator. I get 57 over 4. Ooh, it's tough when you get the fractions. In fact, I need more room. I'm going to scroll down. Here we go. Okay, the next step is to square root both sides. Square root. Oop, can I cut off the 2 there? Square root and square root. So that gets me x plus 5 halves equals, don't forget your plus or minus. I don't know what the square root of 57 is, so I'm just going to write square root of 57. But I do know what the square root of 4 is. That is 2. So I square rooted the top and square rooted the bottom. And then in my last step, I'm going to go ahead and minus 5 halves over, minus 5 halves. And so the final answer I get is x equals negative 5 halves plus or minus root 57 over 2. Oh, that is one ugly question. Yeah, when your middle term is an odd number, it makes it a lot harder. And that's why we have another lesson in section 8.2. I'm going to teach you the ultimate kill, the one that is like right here. It's the best one to use. But before we get there, we do want you to be able to complete the square and root solve, because it's a key part of the final most epic weapon, the golden gun that we'll be talking about. Okay, here we go. Last one for you guys. Go ahead and pause the video now and solve this quadratic. 3x squared plus 9x plus 15 equals 0. Don't forget step 0. Step 0, you got to get the first value equal to 1. Pause the video now. Good luck. Welcome back. Here we go. We got to get, before we start, we've got to get the first number equal to 0. So I'm, not equal to 0, sorry, equal to 1. So I'm dividing everything by 3 here. That gets me, in fact, including the 0, right? We actually divide everything by 3. I get x squared plus 3x plus 5 equals 0. Okay, cool. Let's get the x's all by themselves here. X squared plus 3x. So we're minusing 5. That gets us equals negative 5. We've got to find the poison. We do that by taking b divided by 2 and squaring it. So in this problem, it would be 3 divided by 2 squared, which 3 squared is 9, and 2 squared is 4. So I'm adding 9 fourths to both sides of the equation. This side comes out to be a perfect square, and it's going to be half of 3. So it's going to be x plus 3 halves squared equals, use my calculator here, negative 5 plus 9 fourths. That comes out to be negative 11 fourths. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and square root both sides. Square root, square root. That gets me x plus 3 halves because the power and the root cancel. And I get square root of negative 11, and square root of 4, square root of 4 is 2. Okay. X equals minus the 3 halves over. I get negative 3 halves plus or minus the square root of negative 11 over 2. However, we said that you should never have negative 11. And so we would take that negative 11 out and just write an I. That way we don't have a negative root. And so that right there is our final answer. That's an ugly one. Lots of fractions. It's got some i's in it. Oh yeah, nice work. Okay, well, so far you've learned 2 additional weapons for solving quadratics. In our next video, we'll learn the ultimate weapon, the golden gun, the Excalibur. But first, you work on these ones in your assignment. Don't get too excited yet, and we'll get there in our next lesson. Good luck using root solving and completing the square to kill quadratics. Thanks for watching. Brother O signing out.